Okay, we're going to install the rack now. Got some new hardware, grade 8 bolt, lock washer, and a big flat washer. A little bit of Loctite. Okay, I'll work on getting that centered in the chassis, tighten it up, and we'll work on the tie rod arms. Okay, we've got the rack installed. Now we're going to put in the steering arm. This is the steering arm here, aluminum rod ends. So part of the problem with using a stock spindle is you're stuck with stock locations for ball joints and steering arm. Now you can manipulate the ball joints a little bit like I talked about in my last video with this bottom ball joint. But other than welding and cutting on the steering arm, you're kind of stuck. So there are some ways to get around it, and I'll show you right now. So for race car purposes, the steering rack has to be mounted as low as possible to clear like the engine balancer and pulleys and whatever else might be sticking out the front of the engine. And the problem with that is then your steering arm ends up going way up high like this, which is terrible for bump steer and geometry and so on. So to get around that, what you have to do is use spacers. So what I'm going to do here is take my bolt and a washer and a tapered bearing, or tapered bushing, I mean. Hey, get out. A tapered bushing, slide it on there. What this tapered bushing allows is when you put it in the spherical bearing, it is smaller where it hits the bearing, so that allows more movement. Not a lot more, but a little bit. That goes there. This spacer goes here. Slide that up into the spindle. Shank of my bolt sticking up a little higher than I need, so I'm going to add some AN washers. And I'm just using a regular nut right now. I'll put a nylock on later when I'm happy with the bump steer. Okay, tighten that up on there. Now, This adds a little bit of leverage to the arm. However, in practice, I've seen it done many times without any real bad effects. Some issues could arise when you run into something, or somebody runs into a wheel, or you hit a curb real hard, which at a racetrack doesn't happen too often, but it's not impossible. This leverage could work against you and bend, either twist the arm or bend the bolt, but I doubt it's going to bend the bolt. It'll probably just twist the arm or bend the arm. Another thing you got to watch out for is with this low, you got to make sure that when your wheel goes on, it clears this bolt. Okay, now here on the inside, you can see this angle I've got right now. It still is uphill a little bit, and that's a little too much for getting all the bump steer out. So I have to space this end up as well. Not as much as that, but I have to space it up. Okay, so what we have is the bolt goes through the top. Through an AN washer, through a spacer, a tapered spacer, which goes on top of the spherical bearing here to allow for maximum movement in the steering. Another tapered spacer goes on the bottom, again to allow for maximum movement in the rod end. A bump steer bushing. All that goes through. On the bottom, got another couple spacer washers. And again, just a regular hex nut for now. I'll put a nylock on later when I'm happy with the bump steer. There you have it. Now there are actual tools for checking your bump steer. And your bump steer, which I'm sure most of you know, is when you hit a bump and the suspension goes up or down, the wheel, because of the angles of geometry in the lower control arm, upper control arm, and in the steering tie rod, if the geometry isn't just right, it'll cause the wheel to toe in or toe out when you hit a bump or droop. Then you adjust that by adding spacers here, or taking out spacers there and there. There's an actual tool, it's called a bump steer gauge, and basically it's kind of a steel hoop thing that sits on the ground here, and it has like a little finger that goes in and touches the rotor, and on the front it has a dial indicator that goes in and hits the rotor. And then you bump this up and down, you move it up and down, and you watch the dial indicator, and it shows you your toe in and out. I don't have that tool, so I'm just kind of eyeballing it for now. And I'm hoping you can maybe see it. It's probably not noticeable because I've got most of it worked out. But as you can see, as I go up, I'm looking straight down on it, so it's easier for me to see it. There's pretty much no toe in or toe out. I'm going to pull this jack stand out, and we'll do full droop. And in full droop, there's a little tiny bit of toe out. Which is probably fine, because it'll just add to Ackerman in really tight, high G corners where the car is really pitched over. So now I'll just repeat that on the other side, and we'll move on to the next thing. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.